artists, and welcome back to my channel. My name is Margot and I'm a professional artist and illustrator. And in today's video, I'm going to show you how I set up a custom watercolor palette. So I did a video quite recently about how I set up a custom gouache palette. And I had some people asking me if I set up a watercolor palette differently. And the answer is yes. So today I'm going to show you how I load up this palette. I got a brand new one, but this is my favorite watercolor palette in the whole world. And I get it on Amazon, so I'll link it in the description below. But I'll show you exactly how I set it up, why and where I put the colors, and just my whole rationale for how I set it up. So let's open this, and if you're interested, keep watching. Okay, so let's talk about this palette first. One of the things that is really important to me in a palette is the quality of the mixing surface. I'm not a huge fan of plastic palettes because I don't feel like the paint really sticks to it all that well. So this palette is made of enamel, which performs really well with watercolor. And it has 35 wells. Yeah, you heard me right, 35, that's a lot. And one of my favorite things about this palette is the size of it. So it's quite large and it gives you a lot of room to mix your colors, which I think is really convenient. So let's open it up and you'll see that it is really quite large. It's a big palette. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend this if you're traveling or if your desk is particularly small. But like I mentioned before, there are a lot of wells, 35 of them, and they're quite large as well. So you can load up a lot of paint onto this and it will last you a while. So speaking of loading it up with paint, let's go ahead and do that. I have all of my watercolors prepped, and I already came up with a game plan for how I was going to do this. So I actually created an outline of how I want my palette to be set up. And I know I'm super type A and OCD, but I think that having this game plan will really help me because I took some time to figure out what colors I use the most, what colors I would like to use more frequently, and it just gives me more clarity so I don't get confused along the way or second guess myself. So let's talk about what actual colors we're going to be putting on this palette. So I organize my palette in two columns. So I have my warm colors on one side, my cool colors on another column, and I usually put my neutrals and my browns on the bottom. So you can see that this paper is a literal translation of what the palette is going to look like. Let's start with our warm colors first, so yellows and oranges. And the reason why I have the colors separated into two columns, so by warm and cool colors, is to eliminate the risk of there being muddy colors. So if I separate them, then I don't accidentally bring in a complementary color and cause a muddy mix on that side of the palette. So hopefully that helps to understand a little bit why it's organized this way. So let's start with our yellows. I am going to do a lemon yellow first, and it was a toss-up between Sennelier's lemon yellow and Winsor & Newton, but I decided to go with Winsor & Newton, which I think is the better one of the two. But let me know in the comments below what you think and if you found the perfect lemon yellow or just what your favorite colors are in general. So let's squeeze this out, and what I usually do after squeezing out the paint is I like to spread it out fairly evenly. So it's kind of like buttering or putting peanut butter on a slice of toast. And that just helps the paint grip the palette and create a nice even distribution on that well. Next up is Daniel Smith Nickel Azo Yellow. Azo or Azo? I don't know. How do you pronounce it? Let me know in the comments. So let's put that in the well, and love this particular color. And if you haven't seen my video on my favorite watercolor colors, that's a mouthful. I'm going to add a link in my description below so that you can check out that video. Okay, two yellows down, one more to go, and we're going to do Winsor & Newton's Winsor Yellow Deep, another one that I really love and has a gorgeous marigold color. Isn't it crazy how the Nickel Azo Yellow kind of looks like yellow ochre in the palette? Very interesting how that just looks completely different from what it looks like when you're actually painting it. Very similar observation I'm seeing with the Winsor Yellow Deep, which as I'm spreading it out on the palette looks orange, but when you paint it, it looks yellow. All right, so speaking of oranges, let's move on to our orange section of the palette. And for the next color, I'm going to be doing Daniel Smith Aussie Red Gold, also a recent favorite of mine. I'm really loving this one recently. Next one on the roster is Winsor & Newton Winsor Orange Red shade, the perfect color for an orange or a traffic cone. I don't know where I got that from, but it's a bold and very punchy orange. I mean, look at this pop. And I have to say, even for watercolors that tend to dry a little duller, this one in particular still packs a lot of punch after it's dried. All right, moving on from oranges, we're getting to the reds. And the first one is going to be kind of an outlier, which is Magello Mission's Permanent Red. And it's actually a really nice, very vivid red that, just like the Winsor Orange Red shade, dries to be very saturated. So if you're on the market for a watercolor that's a very vivid primary red and that doesn't dull when it's dried, I would recommend checking out the Magello Mission Gold series in the Permanent Red color. Next up is Winsor & Newton Winsor Red Deep. And if you want a red that plays really well with blues, this one is a really good one to try because it has a lot of blue already in it. So if you are looking to mix your own purple or you're painting something with a lot of blue in it and you want to introduce a red that's going to play nice with the rest of your colors and not give you mud, then this is a good one to try. All right, what do we have next? We have, okay, so Winsor & Newton Venetian Red. And so this one is sort of like a more brown or more earthy red. And I like to think of this red as the red that the masters of the past used. So if you think of paintings of Rembrandt or Leonardo da Vinci, it's this very complex and very earthy red, which I think is beautiful. Now, onwards to the pinks, we're going to do a Daniel Smith quinacridone magenta, and I usually do Winsor & Newton's quinacridone, but for today, let's do the Daniel Smith. Let's do something a little different. And I always say, if you can only use one pink, then let that be quinacridone magenta because it's super versatile and you can use it to do pretty much anything. So I think I've called it a Swiss Army knife of pinks before because it really just, you get a lot for your money with this one. All right, next up is Winsor & Newton's Permanent Mauve, and this one's a little bit old and dried up, so I'm having trouble getting it out, but it might be a little bit stiff coming out of the tube. Let's see how it does. Yeah, I'm gonna have to wet this quite a lot just to get it to spread out evenly, but as you can see, once you add water, it easily just dissolves and becomes, soluble with water. Now we're going to do some brighter pinks now. We're going to do Holbein's Bright Rose, which is a very poppy, very like a neon nearly, a neon type of pink, which is also handy to have on the palette, as well as Daniel Smith's Opera Pink. So let's squeeze out the Holbein Bright Rose first, and you'll see just how much that pops on the palette. Okay, no, not at all. You really don't see how much it pops on the palette. Just like with some of the other colors that I showed you, it's actually much more concentrated on the palette. So when you put it on paper, it's going to be a lot brighter. Okay, so next up we have Opera Rose, which is, I would say, probably the world's favorite fugitive pigment. And if you're thinking fugitive, like in Tommy Lee Jones comes to mind, that's not what I mean at all. It's mostly just a description for a type of pigment that isn't as light fast. So light fast meaning that it doesn't fade with time. And so with Opera Rose, it tends to fade over time, unlike some other colors. So it's not something that I let affect my choice of colors, but a good thing to know nonetheless. Now that we have the brighter pinks in our palette, we're going to go with some more muted options. So I have Winsor & Newton's Potter's Pink, a really elegant and muted pink, sort of like an old rose. And it's a fairly translucent color, so even on the palette, as you can see right here, it's not getting too opaque. It's staying quite transparent. All right, and the last pink that we have on this palette is going to be Winsor & Newton's Rose Doré. And if you're one of the people who has seen my video about my favorite watercolor colors, then you'll know that this particular color I speak very highly of because it's very unique and it's a very difficult color to mix. So I really recommend this radiant pink. Before we move on to the next video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe so you can let YouTube know that this is some good content and it can recommend it to other people who are looking for this as well. So let's keep going. All right, so we have our entire left column all done with our warm tones. So moving on now to the browns and the neutrals, I'm going to start by filling this larger well on the lower left-hand corner with Winsor & Newton's Sepia. And sepia is a color that I use a lot. I use it for darkening my colors and creating more complex colors, and so I'm going to put a lot of it onto this palette. Okay, so next up I'm going to do Winsor & Newton's Yellow Ochre, which is another color that I use quite a lot for mixing mostly. I never really use this straight out of the tube. So if you want to mix your colors to have a little bit more warmth to them, then this is a great way to get a nice golden undertone to that color. So next in the color family of the earth tones, we have Winsor & Newton's Burnt Sienna, which has a bit more of a red cast to it. So it has, I would say, more of like a mahogany kind of character to it. Then we're going to do Winsor & Newton's Burnt Umber. And this one, again, is a little bit dry. I have a lot of old paints, as you can see, but we're still going to try to squeeze that out. And this one is a little bit more neutral. So whereas the yellow ochre was a warmer color and the burnt sienna was a bit redder, then the burnt umber is a slightly more neutral type of brown. Okay, so the final two colors at the bottom of this palette with the neutrals are actually going to be for gray and indigo, because I consider those to be neutrals for me as well. They're not in the earth tones, but I like to use them together with earth tones or just in general as neutral colors. So the first one is going to be Winsor & Newton's Payne's Gray. And so this has a very nice grayish, slightly blue tint to it. It's perfect for cooling down colors, so just like the earth tones will warm up other colors, this will help to create cooler versions. And then Indigo by Winsor & Newton also, which I think is my most used color. I just go through tubes of these like water. And I use this for creating black, actually. So I end up mixing the sienna with indigo to create my blacks. Since I don't, and you'll see later in this video, I don't actually use black straight out of the tube. Okay, so we are halfway there. I'm going to do the cooler colors next, and that's going to start with my violets and purples, starting with Daniel Smith's Imperial Purple, my new favorite purple. This is absolutely gorgeous, and it has a little bit of a pink granulation in it, which I think is really interesting. And if you don't know what granulation is, it's basically like a little bit of a sandy texture that appears after the paint has dried, which can be really interesting. Okay, next up I have the Winsor & Newton Dioxazine Violet, which to me has always been, I call it the OG. It's really saturated, it's really buildable, and you can get some really nice, deep, rich tones from this one violet. Next is another Daniel Smith, and you'll soon see that this side of the palette is quickly being colonized by Daniel Smith because the colors are sensational. So this one is Daniel Smith Moonglow. Absolutely adore this one. It has a little bit of purple in it, some blue, a little bit of gray, kind of like that ghostly glow you get in the middle of a moonlit night. Speaking of the moon, the next one is also Daniel Smith and also about the moon, funny enough, and that is Daniel Smith's Lunar Blue, another fantastic, very complex color. And if the Moonglow had a bit of a purple cast to it, this one edges more on the blue side, and it's sort of like the color you would find on the surface of the moon. So blue-gray, but still has a beautiful radiance to it. So we're going to move on to the blues now. So this is actually my favorite part because blues and greens are my favorite colors to work with. So I'm going to start with Winsor & Newton's Prussian Blue, which is a beautiful color, and it shares some similarities with indigo. However, it's more of a midnight blue. It's less gray. So you could use this for something like an ocean or anything where you need like a deep, rich navy blue. I'm going to consult my my little sheet again, and so right after, let's see, the Prussian Blue, I'm going to put French Ultramarine because I'm kind of going to do this in an order from most saturated blues to more greenish or turquoisey blues. So for the Ultramarine, I'm going to do kind of an outlier here, which is Sennelier's French Ultramarine. And of all the Sennelier paints, which I'm, to be honest, not quite a fan of, maybe I should do a video about watercolor watercolor brands? Let me know in the comments below. I really love Sennelier's French Ultramarine. I think there's nothing else like that, and maybe leave it to the French to create the best French ultramarine, but I think it's definitely the best one that I've found. Next up is Winsor & Newton's Winsor Blue Green shade, which is a lovely shade of blue. It has a little bit of a green tint to it, which, how do we describe it? Kind of like if you imagine the center of the feather of a peacock. That's kind of that electric punchy blue that I'm talking about here. We're going to do cerulean blue next, and it's kind of a toss-up between Daniel Smith and Winsor & Newton, but I happen to like the Winsor & Newton cerulean better, so that's what I'm going to put on this palette. The Winsor & Newton has a little bit more of an edge, in my opinion, so it has more saturation, and I think that it just performs better than the Daniel Smith. So let's put that in this well and move on to our next color. And that is going to be Winsor & Newton's Phthalo Turquoise. And this color is sort of like what you would imagine the waters of a tropical destination like Bora Bora would be. So it's a true turquoise with beautiful luminosity to it. We are done now with the blues, so let's shift gears here and get into the land of the greens. The most important green that I'm going to have in my entire palette is Winsor & Newton's Sap Green. This is the green that I use for most of my leaves, foliage, landscapes. Pretty much anything that's botanical based will either be done with sap green or have sap green mixed into my color. Then the dark and handsome older brother of sap green is Daniel Smith's Dark Sap Green. This one is really interesting, and it's as if somebody took sap green and just added a lot more of a darker mood and tone to it. And using these together, so the sap green and the dark sap green, is a really great way of leveling up your usage of these colors, because when you use them together, it creates so much more depth and dimensionality. 4 more colors to go, so let's check in on our map. And we have 4 more colors. We've got Cascade Green by Daniel Smith, and this is a phenomenal green. It's like looking at the moss-covered pebbles at the bottom of a brook and seeing that green through the water. I know that's a really colorful description, but essentially it's like a grayish green with a little bit of blue to it, so it's a very sophisticated color. Then we're going to add Winsor & Newton's Winsor Green yellow shade. And this is sort of like an emerald green. And I used this recently on a painting I did of the Wizard of Oz, and I used it for the Emerald City because it's so vibrant and punchy. Nearing the home stretch here, we have Winsor & Newton's Olive Green, which is a warmer, yellower green. Very nice also for landscapes and for anything natural or botanical. This is another great one to mix with the sap green or the dark sap green. And last but not least is Daniel Smith's Undersea Green. And this one is also a very complex, very interesting color. Kind of like algae, or if you imagine a fishbowl that hasn't been cleaned in weeks. I'm sorry, that's a very strange visual, but you know that overgrown underwater green that you get only from marine life. So that's the kind of green we're talking about here. Okay, so let me clean up my brush and we are done here. And that's it. I hope you enjoyed this video and that it gave you some ideas. As always, thank you so much for watching. Keep painting, and I'll see you in the next video.